On July 14, 1984, millions of wrestling fans across America turned on their televisions expecting to see the same Saturday Night Wrestling they had watched for 12 years. Instead, they saw Vince McMahon standing in the middle of their screen, telling them everything was about to change. He was right, but not in the way he expected. In this video, we break down the year the National Wrestling Alliance began to die. The year territories started falling like dominoes. The year one family buried a son and crowned a champion on the same stage. And the year the man who tried to destroy the National Wrestling Alliance accidentally created the war that would define professional wrestling for the next 2 decades. This is National Wrestling Alliance in 1984. Explained. To understand what happened in 1984, you have to understand what the National Wrestling Alliance was and how it worked, because it was unlike anything that exists in wrestling today. The National Wrestling Alliance was founded in 1948. It was not a wrestling promotion. It was a governing body, a coalition of regional promoters who agreed to cooperate under a shared set of rules. Each promoter controlled a specific geographic territory. Jim Crockett Jr. had Virginia and the Carolinas. Fritz von Erich had Dallas and most of Texas. Bill Watts controlled Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Championship Wrestling from Florida belonged to the Graham family. Georgia Championship Wrestling operated out of Atlanta. And there were others: Portland, St. Louis. Central States, the Memphis territory run by Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler. Each territory ran its own shows, promoted its own talent, and crowned its own regional champions. But they all recognized one man as the undisputed world heavyweight champion. That champion would travel from territory to territory, defending the belt against each region's top star. He would wrestle in Dallas one night, fly to St. Louis the next, then head to Charlotte, then Tokyo, then back to Florida. The schedule was absolutely grueling. Sometimes 250 days a year on the road, red-eye flights, rental cars driven through the night, towns that blurred together until the only thing that stayed sharp was the championship belt and the crowd waiting to see it. But it served a critical purpose. When the National Wrestling Alliance World Champion came to your territory, it was an event. It meant something. The local promoter would build weeks of television around that single appearance. The top babyface in the territory would cut promos about finally getting his shot. The fans would line up and pay premium prices because they knew this was their one chance to see the biggest prize in professional wrestling defended live in their building against their guy. The system depended on trust. Every promoter had to believe that the other promoters would respect boundaries, that nobody would steal talent, that nobody would invade another man's territory. And for decades, that trust held. The National Wrestling Alliance was not perfect. There were power struggles and backstabbing and politics. But the fundamental agreement, the handshake that said we will coexist, remained intact until 1984. Until one man decided that coexistence was no longer enough. And the champion carrying the belt through that storm was Ric Flair. Flair had won the title from Harley Race inside a steel cage at Starrcade 1983 the previous November. He entered 1984 as the undisputed standard-bearer of the National Wrestling Alliance, and he carried that responsibility like no one before or since. Flair was not just a champion, he was the connective tissue that held the entire system together. Every territory needed him. Every territory depended on his ability to walk into an arena, make the local babyface look like $1 million, and leave the fans desperate to see the rematch. In 1984 alone, Flair defended the world title well over 100 times across multiple countries and continents. He wrestled in the Carolinas, in Texas, in Florida, in St. Louis, in Japan, in Singapore, in New Zealand, in Puerto Rico, in the Virgin Islands, in Trinidad. He faced Harley Race, Kerry Von Erich, Dusty Rhodes, Ricky Steamboat, Bruiser Brody, Wahoo McDaniel, Barry Windham, Carlos Colon, Jack Briscoe, Billy Jack Haynes, and dozens of others. And he did it at a level of consistency that defied logic. Night after night, town after town, Flair delivered, but by 1984, the system Flair was defending was already under siege. and the man leading the assault was Vince McMahon. McMahon had purchased the World Wrestling Federation from his father in 1982 and immediately began doing something no promoter had ever dared to do. He started expanding beyond his territory. The unwritten rule of professional wrestling for decades was simple. You stayed in your lane. You promoted shows in your region and nowhere else. McMahon threw that rulebook in the trash. He started by raiding talent. He went after the biggest stars in every territory and offered them more money, more exposure, and a spot on national television. In January 1984, he crowned Hulk Hogan as his World Wrestling Federation champion, and Hulkamania was born. Then he went after the television. McMahon already had syndicated programming and a prime cable deal on the USA Network. But he wanted more. He wanted total domination of the American wrestling landscape, and that desire led directly to the single most devastating blow the National Wrestling Alliance suffered in 1984, an event that became known as Black Saturday. Georgia Championship Wrestling had been on superstation WTBS since 1972. Their flagship program, World Championship Wrestling, aired every Saturday night at 6:05 p.m. Eastern. It was the first National Wrestling Alliance territory to have a national cable television deal. And by the early 1980s, it was being beamed into tens of millions of homes across America. For National Wrestling Alliance fans who lived outside any territory, the Georgia show on WTBS was their lifeline to real wrestling. McMahon wanted that time slot. He approached Ted Turner, the owner of WTBS, and offered to buy the Saturday night slot outright. Turner said no. So McMahon went around him. He approached the shareholders of Georgia Championship Wrestling. Jack and Jerry Briscoe, both wrestling legends, held major stakes in the company. So did Jim Barnett, a longtime power broker in the business. All three were unhappy with how Ole Anderson, who was running GCW at the time, was managing things. The Briscoes felt they were being shortchanged financially, despite the company drawing strong crowds in expansion markets like Ohio and Michigan. They had tried an internal takeover of the company and failed. McMahon offered them a way out. He would buy their shares. That would give him controlling interest in GCW and, more importantly, control of its WTBS time slot. The Briscoes agreed. Barnett followed, and just like that, Vince McMahon owned the most important wrestling television slot in America outside of his own programming. The last World Championship Wrestling program under Georgia Championship Wrestling control aired on July 7, 1984. 1 week later, on July 14th, the show opened and there was Freddie Miller, the ring announcer, introducing McMahon to the TBS audience. Gordon Solie, the legendary voice of Georgia wrestling, the man fans called the Walter Cronkite of professional wrestling, was gone. He had either resigned in protest or been let go in the transition. Nobody has ever gotten a completely straight answer about which one it was. And then the programming started, and it was a disaster. Instead of the live studio wrestling that Southern fans loved, instead of the hard-hitting athletic style that had defined Georgia Championship Wrestling for over a decade, McMahon aired recycled highlights from his WWF programming. Squash matches, cartoonish characters, the kind of entertainment-first approach that GCW fans absolutely despised. It was like replacing a steak dinner with cotton candy and expecting the same customers to keep coming back. They did not come back. Thousands of angry letters and phone calls poured into TBS. The ratings cratered. Fans wanted their wrestling back. They wanted Gordon Solie. They wanted Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes and the Koloffs and Tully Blanchard. What they got instead was Bobo Brazil fighting John Studd and interviews with George Steele. Ted Turner was furious, not because he cared about the wrestling itself, but because his ratings were tanking and his audience was in open revolt. So Turner did something clever. He gave Bill Watts, who ran Midsouth Wrestling out of Oklahoma, a Sunday time slot on TBS. Then he gave Ole Anderson, who had launched a new National Wrestling Alliance-affiliated promotion called Championship Wrestling from Georgia after being pushed out of GCW, a Saturday morning slot with Gordon Solie as the lead announcer. McMahon was outraged. He had paid good money for what he thought was exclusive wrestling access on TBS. But Turner had outmaneuvered him, and the results were humiliating. Both Mid-South and Championship Wrestling from Georgia outdrew the World Wrestling Federation in the ratings. McMahon was losing money on the deal and getting embarrassed in the process. Eventually, Jim Barnett brokered a solution. He connected McMahon with National Wrestling Alliance president Jim Crockett Jr., who was running Jim Crockett Promotions out of Charlotte. Crockett bought the TBS time slot from McMahon for $1 million and absorbed Ole Anderson's CWG promotion in the process. National Wrestling Alliance programming returned to TBS. But Black Saturday left scars that never fully healed. It proved that McMahon was willing to do anything to eliminate the competition. It proved that the old territorial agreements meant nothing anymore. It proved that television time slots, the lifeblood of every wrestling territory, could be purchased out from under a promoter with nothing more than a checkbook and a willingness to deal. And it exposed a fundamental weakness in the National Wrestling Alliance system. The Briscoes and Barnett sold because they were unhappy with their own company's management. They did not sell because McMahon held a gun to their heads. They sold because the National Wrestling Alliance's internal politics had created exactly the kind of resentment and dysfunction that an outsider could exploit. McMahon did not break into the house. He was invited in by people who had the keys and wanted to burn it down for their own reasons. The whole debacle also set in motion the personal rivalry between McMahon and Turner that would eventually explode into the Monday Night Wars. Turner never forgot that McMahon had tried to monopolize wrestling on his network. McMahon never forgot that Turner had undermined his TBS deal by giving time slots to competing promotions. That grudge would simmer for a decade before boiling over into the most intense period of competition the wrestling industry has ever known. But Black Saturday was not the only tragedy the National Wrestling Alliance faced in 1984. Not even close. On February 10, 1984, David Von Erich was found lifeless in his hotel room in Tokyo during a tour of Japan. He was 25 years old. The official cause was listed as acute enteritis, essentially a stomach ailment. But wrestlers who were there told a very different story. Multiple people in the business have said it was a drug overdose, and that Bruiser Brody, who was reportedly in the room, flushed the substances before anyone else arrived. David's passing devastated the wrestling world, but it hit world-class championship wrestling in Texas harder than anywhere else. The Von Erichs were not just wrestlers in Dallas. They were royalty. Fritz von Erich, the family patriarch, had built the entire territory around his sons. And David was supposed to be the one, the chosen heir, the future National Wrestling Alliance world champion. Ric Flair himself has said that David was being groomed for the title. Harley Race agreed the National Wrestling Alliance board had reportedly discussed the transition. David Von Erich was going to carry the belt that Flair, Race, and Dory Funk Jr. had carried before him. He had the size, the talent, and the charisma to be a traveling world champion in the traditional National Wrestling Alliance mold. And then he was gone. Fritz von Erich responded by doing what promoters do. He turned grief into business. He announced the David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions, to be held on May 6, 1984, at Texas Stadium in Irving, Texas. The main event would be Kerry Von Erich challenging Ric Flair for the National Wrestling Alliance World Heavyweight Championship. The title match that had been earmarked for David would now belong to his younger brother. Over 32,000 fans packed Texas Stadium on a brutally hot May afternoon. The temperature on the field reached 100 degrees. But nobody cared. They were there to witness something bigger than a wrestling match. They were there to watch a family fulfill a dream that had been stolen from them. The card was stacked. The Von Erichs took the World Six-Man Tag Team Championship from the fabulous Freebirds, with Fritz himself coming out of retirement to team with Kevin and Mike. But everyone was waiting for the main event. Flair defended the title with no time limit and a stipulation that a disqualification would cost him the belt. The match built slowly, methodically, in the Flair style. Kerry overpowered the champion early. Flair cheated and clawed his way back, and then in a moment that felt almost too perfect to be real, Kerry reversed a hip toss attempt into a backslide. 1, 2, 3. Texas Stadium erupted. Kerry von Erich was the National Wrestling Alliance World Heavyweight Champion. He stood in the ring, tears streaming down his face, wearing a robe that read, "In Memory of David," with a yellow rose embroidered on it. His family surrounded him. The entire WCCW babyface roster came out to celebrate. A song called "Heaven Needed a Champion" played over the speakers. It was one of the most powerful moments in the history of professional wrestling, and it lasted exactly 18 days. On May 24th, in Yokosuka, Japan, Flair defeated Kerry in a 2 out of 3 falls match to regain the championship. The title went back where the National Wrestling Alliance needed it to be, on the waist of their traveling champion who could draw money in every territory. Kerry's reign had always been designed as a short-term tribute. Some say that was the deal from the beginning. Flair has said Kerry lost the belt early because he no-showed dates and was becoming unreliable. Either way, the Von Erich moment at Texas Stadium remains one of the most bittersweet nights in wrestling history. A family got its fairy tale ending, knowing all along it could not last. Pro Wrestling Illustrated named the Flair-Kerry match its match of the year for 1984. Back in Texas, world-class championship wrestling continued to produce compelling television even as the shadow of David's passing hung over everything. The Von Erichs versus Fabulous Freebirds rivalry, which had been the hottest feud in American wrestling for over a year, kept driving business. In September, Chris Adams turned heel on Kevin Von Erich, creating a new top program that would carry the territory into 1985. Gino Hernandez returned to add another layer to the conflict. WCCW's television show was syndicated to stations across the country, making it one of the most visible National Wrestling Alliance territories nationally. But beneath the surface, the cracks were forming. The Von Erich family's personal demons were deepening. Mike Von Erich, the youngest brother wrestling at the time, was clearly not at the same level as his brothers. The pressure on the family to keep performing, to keep being the beloved heroes of Texas, was becoming unsustainable. The Parade of Champions would be held again in future years, each time dedicated to another fallen Von Erich. The 1984 edition, as magnificent and emotional as it was, marked the beginning of the end for the family and for the territory. While the Von Erichs were living out their tragedy in Texas, Jim Crockett Promotions was trying to hold the National Wrestling Alliance together from Charlotte, and 1984 was a year of both remarkable television and painful losses for JCP. The Mid-Atlantic territory was producing some of the best in-ring wrestling in America. Ricky Steamboat won the National Wrestling Alliance United States Championship from Dick Slater in April and became the workhorse of the territory. His feuds with Tully Blanchard and Wahoo McDaniel produced match after match of outstanding action. Blanchard held the National Wrestling Alliance Television Championship for most of the year, using every trick in the book, aided by his manager J.J. Dillon, to hold on to the gold. Blanchard was one of the great heel champions of the era. Arrogant, skilled, willing to cheat when skill was not enough. Dusty Rhodes was the top babyface. The American Dream had staked his claim to a world title shot at Starrcade 1983, and he spent all of 1984 chasing Flair while also teaming with Manny Fernandez. Rhodes and Fernandez won the National Wrestling Alliance World Tag Team Championship from Ivan Koloff and Don Knodel in July, giving Rhodes gold to carry while the world title chase continued building toward the November showdown. But the World Wrestling Federation's raids were bleeding JCP dry. Roddy Piper had left the Mid-Atlantic territory in January 1984 to become one of the biggest stars in World Wrestling Federation history. Bob Orton Jr. departed while still holding the National Wrestling Alliance Tag Team Championship, jumping to the World Wrestling Federation where he became Piper's right-hand man. Barry Windham arrived in JCP mid-year and was positioned as a major new babyface, a future main eventer. He was even talking about competing at Starrcade. But by late 1984, McMahon had poached him too. Windham and Mike Rotunda left for the World Wrestling Federation, where they debuted as the US Express. Both appeared at the first WrestleMania, and then there was Steamboat. After Starrcade 1984, Ricky Steamboat looked at the booking and realized that Dusty Rhodes, who was also the head booker, had penciled himself in to end Tully Blanchard's television championship reign, instead of giving Steamboat the payoff that the storyline had been building toward all year. Steamboat was furious. He had spent months putting over Blanchard in matches, building the rivalry, making fans believe that the Dragon would eventually slay the arrogant champion. And now Rhodes was going to take that moment for himself. Steamboat left. He went to the World Wrestling Federation in early 1985 and eventually produced one of the greatest matches of all time against Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3. But his departure left yet another hole in a National Wrestling Alliance roster that was already dangerously thin. Meanwhile, down in Oklahoma and Louisiana, Bill Watts was running what many consider the best wrestling television show of the entire decade. Mid-South Wrestling in 1984 was a masterclass in storytelling, character development, and pure in-ring action. The year started with one of the most compelling feuds in territory history. Mr. Wrestling II had been the mentor to the young, up-and-coming Magnum TA. They were a tag team, they were partners, they were supposed to trust each other. But when Magnum started rising toward the main event, Mr. Wrestling II snapped. Jealousy consumed him. He turned on his protege, stole the North American Championship, and set up a grudge match that drew massive numbers. On May 13, 1984, in Tulsa, Magnum defeated his former mentor and won the North American title. The student had surpassed the teacher. It was a perfectly told story. The Midnight Express, Bobby Eaton and Dennis Condrey, managed by Jim Cornette, were the top heel tag team. Their rivalry with the Rock and Roll Express, Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson, was arguably the greatest tag team feud of the 1980s. The two teams fought across every arena in the Mid-South territory, delivering classic after classic. And Watts himself came out of retirement for one of the year's biggest angles. When Cornette and the Midnight Express attacked Watts on television, the old cowboy suited up one more time. He teamed with a masked man called Stagger Lee, who was obviously the Junkyard Dog in disguise, and the two took on the Midnights at a Superdome show that drew 22,000 fans. For a regional territory card, that was an extraordinary number, but even Mid-South could not escape McMahon's reach. In the summer of 1984, the Junkyard Dog, the most popular wrestler in the territory and one of the biggest stars in the entire National Wrestling Alliance, gave a locker room speech about rallying together to fight the World Wrestling Federation invasion, about standing united against McMahon, about protecting Mid-South Wrestling. A week later, he was gone. He had jumped to the World Wrestling Federation without notice, leaving shows that had already been advertised with his name on them. Bill Watts was furious. He buried JYD on television, showing losses and telling fans that the dog had run away because the competition was too tough. But the damage was done. Mid-South's biggest drawing card was now dancing down the aisle at Madison Square Garden, and no amount of spin could replace the charisma that Junkyard Dog had taken with him. Watts tried to fill the void. He pushed Butch Reed as a top heel. He brought in Master G, a former partner of Reed's named George Wells, to try to fill JYD's role as the African-American babyface who could transcend racial lines and draw every demographic. It did not work. Wells was a perfectly competent wrestler, but he did not have even a fraction of the supernatural charisma that had made Junkyard Dog a phenomenon. Nobody did. Watts elevated Magnum TA and Jim Duggan into the main event scene. He brought in Steve Williams, a legitimate amateur wrestling standout from the University of Oklahoma, as another future star. And to his credit, 1984 and 1985 were arguably Mid-South's creative peak, even without JYD. The ensemble cast that replaced a single headliner produced some of the most compelling television wrestling has ever seen. But the territory had lost its biggest star, and everybody knew it. The whole JYD left could be worked around, but never filled. The National Wrestling Alliance's year culminated with Starrcade 1984, subtitled The $1 Million Challenge. It was held on November 22nd, Thanksgiving night, at the Greensboro Coliseum. 16,000 fans filled the arena. The show was broadcast on closed-circuit television across the JCP territory. The main event had been building for an entire year. Ric Flair defending the National Wrestling Alliance World Heavyweight Championship against Dusty Rhodes. The stipulation was that the winner would receive $1 million purse in addition to the title. Jim Crockett Jr. had publicly withdrawn the cash from a bank to sell the legitimacy of the prize. Former boxing heavyweight champion Joe Frazier was brought in as the special guest referee. NASCAR driver Kyle Petty served as a guest judge in case the match went the full 60 minutes. The $1 million prize underscored the importance of the main event. The presentation was designed to make Starrcade feel like a legitimate sporting event. A super fight, the National Wrestling Alliance's answer to everything the World Wrestling Federation was doing. Crockett wanted his show to look and feel like the Super Bowl of professional wrestling. The match itself was solid, but not spectacular. Rhodes worked over Flair's leg, which was unusual since that was typically Flair's strategy. Flair fired back with chops and his signature offense. The crowd was engaged, the story was building. And then, just 12 minutes into the match, Flair shoved Rhodes into the ring post and busted him open. Joe Frazier stepped in to examine the cut. Rhodes was bleeding heavily, and then Frazier did what a boxing referee would do. He stopped the fight. He called for the bell because of the cut. Flair retained the title. He grabbed the $1 million check and got out of Dodge. The crowd was furious. The finish felt completely anticlimactic after a year of build-up. A 12-minute main event ending on a referee stoppage at the biggest show of the year. It was a gut punch to the paying audience. Flair later said on his podcast that Frazier messed it up, that he called the match too early and that it was not supposed to end that way. Whether that is true or whether the finish was always the plan is still debated. But Dusty Rhodes, ever the opportunist, used the outrage to set up a rematch at Starrcade. 1985. If the fans felt robbed, that meant they would pay to see it again. The rest of the Starrcade card had its moments. Tully Blanchard defeated Ricky Steamboat in what many consider a forgotten gem, a match that deserved to be remembered far more than it has been. Manny Fernandez won the Brass Knuckles Championship from Black Bart. Wahoo McDaniel retained the United States title over superstar Billy Graham. But the overall show felt diminished. The talent losses to the World Wrestling Federation were visible everywhere you looked. Barry Windham, who had been one of JCP's hottest new acquisitions, was already on his way out the door to McMahon. Mike Rotunda was going with him. Steamboat, who had just delivered one of the best performances on the card against Blanchard, would be gone within weeks. The roster was visibly thinner than it had been at Starrcade 1983, and the main event finish left a sour taste that lingered long after the Greensboro Coliseum went dark. Starrcade 1984 was supposed to prove that the National Wrestling Alliance could compete with the World Wrestling Federation on the big event stage. Instead, it proved that even the National Wrestling Alliance's crown jewel was starting to tarnish. In the final months of 1984, the National Wrestling Alliance made one more desperate attempt to fight back against McMahon. Several promoters from National Wrestling Alliance territories joined forces with Laverne Clarence's American Wrestling Association to create Pro Wrestling USA. The coalition included Jim Crockett Promotions, the AWA, Championship Wrestling from Georgia, Memphis, and World Class. The idea was to pool resources and talent, run combined cards featuring both National Wrestling Alliance and AWA champions, present a united front that could compete with the World Wrestling Federation on a national level. Their first television show debuted on WP1X in New York City on September 29, 1984. They ran combined supercards, most notably at the Meadowlands in East Rutherford, New Jersey, where fans could see Ric Flair defend the National Wrestling Alliance title and Rick Martel defend the AWA title on the same night. It was an aggressive play, taking the fight directly into McMahon's backyard. But Pro Wrestling USA was doomed from the start. The promoters involved were territorial by nature. They had spent their entire careers protecting their regions, hoarding their talent, and competing with each other. Asking them to suddenly cooperate and share was like asking wolves to share a kill. Egos clashed. Booking disputes erupted. Nobody could agree on who should go over, whose talent should be featured, or how revenue should be split. By early 1986, Pro Wrestling USA was dead. The alliance that was supposed to save the territorial system had collapsed under the weight of the very instincts that created the territorial system in the first place. When you step back and look at the National Wrestling Alliance in 1984 as a whole, what you see is an empire crumbling in real time. Every single pillar that held up the territorial system was being kicked out from under it. The television model was broken. Black Saturday proved that TV time slots could be bought and sold like commodities, and that the local promoter's hold on his audience was far more fragile than anyone had realized. The talent pipeline was compromised. McMahon could offer more money, more exposure, and a national platform. One by one, the biggest names in the National Wrestling Alliance territories were walking out the door. The cooperative model was failing. Pro Wrestling USA showed that National Wrestling Alliance promoters could not put aside their differences even when their survival depended on it. And the tragedies kept mounting. David Von Erich's passing, the Von Erich family's slow, agonizing descent into darkness that would claim more lives in the years to come. The creative compromises that came from Dusty Rhodes booking himself into angles that should have elevated other talent. But here is what makes 1984 so fascinating. Even as everything was falling apart, the National Wrestling Alliance was producing some of the best professional wrestling the world had ever seen. Ric Flair was having the year of his life, defending the world title in every corner of the globe with a consistency and brilliance that may never be matched. Midsouth Wrestling was telling stories that would influence the way wrestling was presented for generations. The Midnight Express and Rock and Roll Express were redefining what tag team wrestling could be. Tully Blanchard and Ricky Steamboat were having matches in the Carolinas that belong in any conversation about the greatest in-ring performers of the 1980s. The National Wrestling Alliance in 1984 was a burning building filled with masterpieces. The fire was already consuming the walls. The roof was starting to cave, but inside, artists were still creating their finest work, knowing that the gallery itself would not survive. Jim Crockett Jr. would spend the next 3 years trying to save what was left. He would buy territory after territory, absorbing Mid-South, Florida, Central States, and the St. Louis office into his expanding empire. He would take JCP National, running shows across the country under the National Wrestling Alliance banner. He would go head-to-head with McMahon in city after city, dollar for dollar, show for show. He would fly his top talent around in a private jet and throw lavish parties at regional offices and spend money like a man who believed he could outrun the inevitable. And he would fail. The spending was unsustainable. The territorial acquisitions drained JCP's coffers faster than the expanded territory could fill them. The World Wrestling Federation was simply too far ahead in the national television game, the merchandising game, the mainstream crossover game. By November 1988, Crockett was near bankruptcy. Through Jim Barnett, who seemed to be involved in every major deal of the era, he sold JCP to Ted Turner. Turner renamed it World Championship Wrestling. The National Wrestling Alliance as a meaningful governing body was effectively finished. The territory system that had sustained professional wrestling for nearly 4 decades was gone. World Class would leave the National Wrestling Alliance entirely in 1986. Mid-South rebranded as the Universal Wrestling Federation before being absorbed by Crockett. Florida folded, Portland faded away. One by one, every territory that had made the National Wrestling Alliance what it was either closed its doors or was swallowed up by the only promoter still standing. 1984 was not the year the National Wrestling Alliance perished. That took a few more years. But it was the year everyone involved knew, deep down, that the end was coming. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into wrestling history. Until next time.